3 wild boys, a chain of abandoned nannies, and a fortress of chaos. No one could tame them. Then a low-profile maid stepped in, offering something nobody else dared: love. What she did next changed their world forever. From the outside, the estate looked like perfection. 40,000 square feet of polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers dangling like frozen raindrops, and sprawling gardens sculpted with precision. The price tag was nearly $50 million, and it carried the weight of luxury in every brick. But inside those glittering gates, chaos reigned. The culprits, 3 little boys. Triplets, 6 years old, identical in their mischief, though unique in their antics. What one didn't think of, another did, and the third executed with terrifying efficiency. To the outside world, they were angelic, dressed in tailored outfits, eyes sparkling with innocence, framed in glossy family portraits. But ask anyone who had worked inside the mansion, and you'd hear the truth whispered like a horror story. These boys were wild, unstoppable, and untamable. They treated the estate less like a home and more like a battlefield. Chandeliers became jungle gyms. Priceless art became canvases for sticky fingers and crayon masterpieces. Every nanny hired, no matter how seasoned, fled within hours, sometimes minutes. Some left in tears, others in fury. A few didn't even bother collecting their last paycheck. The staff had a name for the phenomenon: the curse of the triplets. The billionaire parents tried everything. They interviewed the most experienced nannies from Europe, women who had cared for royalty. They brought in behavioral specialists, stern tutors, even ex-Marines who thought discipline could tame the boys. Each one fell within a day, worn down by the relentless energy and cunning of 3 children who seemed to thrive on resistance. The parents, despite their wealth, found themselves at a loss. They had built empires, managed corporations, and survived the cutthroat world of high finance, yet within their own gilded palace, they were prisoners of chaos. It wasn't that the boys were cruel, far from it. They were clever, brimming with life, their imaginations exploding beyond the marble walls, but without guidance, their creativity turned destructive. They weren't mean, they were lost. They didn't need more rules or threats. They needed someone who saw them not as problems to fix, but as children craving connection. And so the revolving door of nannies spun on, staff whispering bets about how long the next would last. Then one day, into this palace of polished chaos, walked a woman no one expected. She wasn't dressed in tailored suits or exuding authority. She wasn't armed with degrees or recommendations from royal families. She was quiet, steady, her uniform crisp, but simple. A maid. Her name was not important at first. The staff barely noticed her arrival. She came humbly, head bowed, broom in hand, moving quietly through the halls that had chewed up and spat out so many others. No one thought twice about her presence. After all, she wasn't here to discipline or train or control the boys. She was here to clean, to sweep up the trail of toys, wipe down the paint-smeared walls, and restore order after each storm. But the wild boys noticed her. They noticed the way she didn't flinch when they raced through the hallways, nearly knocking over priceless vases. They noticed how she smiled faintly, unbothered by their shrieks and tantrums. Unlike the nannies who barked orders or pleaded desperately, this maid seemed calm. It was almost unsettling. One afternoon, as the boys plotted their next act of destruction, a water balloon ambush from the second-floor balcony, they spotted her below, sweeping slowly, humming softly to herself. No panic, no anger, just quiet, patient presence. For the first time in weeks, the boys paused. They hesitated. The curse of the triplets, it seemed, was about to meet its match, not through force or fear or endless rules, but through something far simpler and far stronger: patience wrapped in love. The mansion didn't know it yet, but its days of mayhem were numbered. The maid began her mornings the same way every day, quietly, without fuss. While other staff rushed in and out, muttering about the boys' latest disasters, she moved at her own pace, a broom in one hand, a soft hum on her lips. The estate was a kingdom of noise, but she carried silence with her like a shield. The triplets didn't know what to make of her. They had tested every nanny with shrieks, tantrums, and tricks. They had learned how to push buttons, how to provoke reactions, and how to watch adults crumble under the pressure of 3 relentless boys. But this woman was different. When they ran screaming through the halls, she didn't yell. When they knocked over her freshly mopped bucket, she didn't scold. She simply picked it up, wiped the floor, and continued her work with the same steady rhythm. At first, they tried harder. One of the boys hurled a toy car across the hallway, watching it clatter dangerously close to her broom. She didn't gasp. She simply bent down, picked it up, and handed it back with a soft smile. "Don't lose it," she said gently, then returned to sweeping. The boys blinked. No lecture, no anger, just calm. The next day, another tried to scare her, leaping out from behind a pillar with a roar. She paused, looked at him with a small amused tilt of her head and said, "That's quite a lion's roar. I bet you can be even louder when you're not hiding." The boy froze. No one had ever acknowledged his play without judgment before. Little by little, the maid began to change the rhythm of the household. Instead of battling their chaos, she redirected it. When they grabbed her broom to swing like swords, she didn't snatch it back. She handed them rags instead. Knights must polish their armor before battle, she explained, and the boys, intrigued by the game, began wiping down tables with surprising diligence. At lunchtime, when they argued over who got the biggest sandwich, she didn't shout. She sliced everything evenly and sat on the floor with them, eating quietly, letting the silence itself soften their quarrels. Soon they stopped fighting, realizing they were too busy watching her chew calmly, as if the whole world wasn't crashing down around her. She never forced rules onto them. She simply created space where they could choose differently. One afternoon, a tantrum exploded. One of the triplets knocked over a vase, shattering it across the marble floor. His face turned red as he stomped and screamed, daring someone to scold him. The staff in the hallway froze. This was always the breaking point for nannies. But the maid didn't raise her voice. She knelt down, carefully picking up the pieces, humming softly all the while. The boy's screams faltered. He watched her work, his anger slowly dissolving in the face of her quiet patience. Finally, she looked up and said, "It must hurt inside, to feel so big and loud. Come help me and maybe it won't hurt as much." The boy hesitated, then crouched down, carefully picking up a shard and placing it in the dustpan she held out. The staff whispered in disbelief. No one had ever seen the boys cooperate like that. Word spread quickly. The maid wasn't just cleaning up messes. She was changing the atmosphere. She wasn't disciplining, yet the boys listened. She wasn't commanding, yet they followed. Somehow, in her soft presence, their chaos found edges. The triplets still had their wild energy, but it no longer burned everything in its path. It began to flow, like a river guided by unseen banks. The mansion, once a storm of shrieks and broken things, was beginning to breathe again, and the parents, who had all but given up hope, started to notice too. The true test came on a rainy afternoon. The sky outside was a dull grey, and the mansion echoed with the restless energy of 3 boys trapped indoors. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows, and the staff braced themselves. Rainy days were the worst. When the triplets couldn't run wild in the gardens, their mischief doubled indoors. It began with a sword fight. The boys had discovered a pair of curtain rods and declared themselves knights. Their shrieks echoed through the halls as they charged at one another, swinging wildly. Priceless vases trembled, paintings tilted, and the staff scattered to avoid being caught in the chaos. One swing knocked over a lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. Another sent a bowl of fruit flying, splattering the marble tiles. And then came the sound that froze everyone in their tracks, a vase shattering into hundreds of pieces. It wasn't just any vase. It was a piece their mother cherished, a gift from her grandmother, placed on a pedestal in the main hall. The boys stopped mid-fight, their eyes wide. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the heavy patter of rain. One of the triplets clenched his fists and screamed, a furious, frustrated cry that rattled the walls. He stomped his feet, tears forming in his eyes. His brothers joined in, not in anger, but in panic, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and defiance. The staff held their breath. This was the breaking point. Every nanny before had failed here, faced with the storm of anger and destruction. This was where voices were raised, threats were made, and ultimatums were shouted. But the maid walked in quietly. She didn't scold, didn't rush, didn't even frown. Instead, she crouched down near the shattered vase and began to pick up the pieces carefully, her movements slow and steady. The boys froze, watching her. She didn't sigh or mutter about how much it cost. She didn't even glance at them with blame in her eyes. She simply hummed softly, the same tune she always carried with her, as if the broken vase were nothing more than another chore. Finally, she looked up at the triplets. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. "It must feel heavy, being this loud inside. Sometimes when we're hurting, we break things outside to match." The boys blinked at her, stunned into silence. No one had ever spoken to them like that. "Would you like to help me fix what we can?" she asked, holding out the dustpan. One of the boys shuffled forward, uncertain. He picked up a shard and placed it carefully inside. His brothers followed, one after another, until all three crouched beside her, helping gather the pieces. The tantrum dissolved into focus. When the last shard was placed in the dustpan, the maid smiled. "See, even broken things can be cared for, and when we care for them, it doesn't hurt so much inside." The boys sat quietly, their wild energy tamed, not by force, but by understanding. For the first time, they weren't being treated as problems to be solved, but as children who needed to be heard. From that day, something shifted. The triplets began to seek her out, not to test her patience, but to be near her calm. They wanted her to watch their games, to share in their laughter. When their energy threatened to spiral, a simple look from her, a soft smile, a gentle hum was enough to ground them. The staff noticed, the parents noticed, even the mansion itself seemed to notice. The chaos that once ruled its halls began to soften. It wasn't that the boys suddenly became obedient angels. They were still wild, still mischievous, but their storms no longer destroyed. Instead, their energy began to find direction, shaped not by rules or punishments, but by patience and love. And the vase, though broken, was carefully glued back together and placed on a shelf. Its cracks remained visible, but they told a story of a turning point, of three boys learning that even broken things and broken tempers could be mended. The weeks that followed marked a quiet transformation inside the mansion. For the first time in years, the staff didn't flinch at the sound of running footsteps or raised voices. The triplets were still energetic, spirited to their very core, but the maid had found a way to soften their edges, to channel their fire without extinguishing it. It didn't happen overnight. There were still tantrums. There were still moments when toys went flying or doors slammed with the force of a hurricane. But what changed was the rhythm. Where once chaos burned without direction, now the flames found purpose. One morning, instead of running wild through the halls, the boys followed the maid to the kitchen. She handed them small tasks. One spread jam on toast, another poured juice into cups, the third carried napkins to the table. The staff watched in disbelief as the three children, who once fought over everything, worked side by side. Breakfast became less of a battleground and more of a ritual, one where the maid's quiet presence guided them like a lighthouse through stormy seas. At playtime, she didn't try to stop their imaginative adventures. Instead, she stepped into their world. When they built forts out of cushions and blankets, she handed them clothespins to make the walls stronger. When they turned broomsticks into spears, she suggested they become protectors instead of destroyers. Soon, their battles weren't against the staff or the furniture, but against imaginary dragons and invading armies. The mansion echoed with laughter instead of screaming. Even bedtime, a nightmare for every nanny who had come before, began to shift. The boys had always resisted bedtime, turning it into a war of wills. But the maid introduced something new. She sat at the edge of their beds, a book in her lap, and began to tell stories. Not just from the pages, but stories from her own childhood, tales of resilience, kindness, and love. Her voice was soft, melodic, weaving pictures in their minds until their eyes grew heavy. For the first time in their young lives, the triplets fell asleep without protest, their faces relaxed, their hands unclenched. The mansion itself seemed to sigh in relief. The parents began to notice too. At first, they thought it was coincidence, a calmer dinner here, a quieter morning there. But slowly, the evidence piled up. Teachers sent notes saying the boys were more attentive in their lessons. Guests commented on how different the children seemed, still full of life, but more centered, less frantic. One evening, their mother returned home early from a meeting and froze at the sight before her, the three boys sitting cross-legged in the living room, drawing pictures together while the maid hummed nearby. Not fighting, not screaming, just together. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Their father noticed too, though in his own way. He had once dismissed the chaos of his sons as something that would toughen them up. But now, seeing them calmer, kinder, more focused, he realized something vital. Strength didn't come from unchecked wildness. It came from learning how to direct it, and the maid had given them that gift. The staff, once exhausted and cynical, began to feel hope. The mansion wasn't just surviving anymore, it was healing. But perhaps the biggest change was in the boys themselves. They began to seek out the maid's presence, not to provoke, but to share. One would proudly show her a Lego creation, another would tug on her sleeve to ask her to watch a somersault, the third would whisper, "Ekrets" in her ear, trusting her with thoughts he hadn't dared share before. The walls of the mansion, once echoing with defiance and destruction, now carried new sounds, giggles, whispers, the soft hum of lullabies. No one could deny it any more. The maid had done what no nanny, no tutor, no expert could accomplish. She hadn't just managed the boys, she had connected with them. She had seen them not as terrors, but as children longing for love and attention. And in doing so, she had changed not only the boys, but the very rhythm of life inside the $50 million estate. The shift in the mansion didn't go unnoticed. At first, the parents thought it was luck. Perhaps the boys were simply outgrowing their tantrums. But the staff knew better. They had seen the revolving door of nannies, the endless parade of experts who failed to last even a day. What was happening now wasn't chance. It was the maid. The mother, elegant and composed even when exhausted, began to linger more when she came home from business meetings. She'd pause in the doorway of the living room, watching her sons sprawl across the carpet with crayons in hand, their laughter filling the air instead of screams. The maid would be there too, sometimes sketching alongside them, other times simply watching with a smile. One evening, curiosity overcame her. "How do you do it?" she asked softly, when the boys had gone to bed. The maid looked up from folding a blanket, her expression calm. "Do what, ma'am?" "Get them to listen, to calm down, to be like this." The mother's voice trembled, revealing years of pent-up frustration and guilt. The maid hesitated, then said gently, "They don't need someone to control them. They need someone to see them." The words struck deeper than the mother expected. For years, she and her husband had been consumed by work, by meetings, by deals worth billions. They had assumed their sons were simply difficult and that money could buy the solution. But, standing there, hearing the maid's quiet truth, she felt the sting of realization. Her sons hadn't needed another strict rule. They had needed her. From that night on, the parents began to watch more closely. They saw how their children flocked to the maid, not out of fear but out of trust. They saw how she never raised her voice, how she redirected energy instead of punishing it. They saw her patience, her ability to wait through a tantrum until the storm passed. It was love disguised as endurance. The father, a man rarely given to displays of emotion, was harder to convince, but even he couldn't deny the change. He walked into the garden one Saturday to find the triplets working together to build a miniature fortress out of cardboard boxes. The maid sat nearby, sipping tea, letting them figure it out. When one box collapsed, the boys argued briefly, but instead of spiraling into chaos, they regrouped and rebuilt. The father watched with astonishment. He remembered weeks ago when a small disagreement would have ended in broken furniture and bruised egos. Now, with the maid's quiet guidance, they were learning cooperation. That night, he admitted aloud for the first time, "She's done what none of us could." Recognition soon grew into gratitude. The parents began inviting the maid to family dinners. At first, she declined, insisting she was staff and not family. But the mother insisted gently, "You've earned more than a paycheck. You've earned a seat at our table." The boys, of course, were thrilled. They scrambled to sit beside her, each fighting for her attention. "Sit next to me," one would shout, while another tugged her sleeve. She laughed softly, finally settling between them, cutting their food and listening to their endless stories. It was during one of these dinners that the eldest of the triplets, his face serious in a way unusual for a 6-year-old, spoke up and asked, "Are you going to leave, like the others?" The room grew quiet. The maid placed her hand gently over his. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere." The relief on the boys' faces was immediate. They leaned into her, clinging as though afraid she'd vanish the moment they blinked, and in that instant, the parents realized something profound. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She had become the anchor their family had been missing. It wasn't just about keeping the mansion in order, it was about keeping hearts in order. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a battlefield or a business deal. It felt like a home. And the maid, once invisible, overlooked, underestimated, had become the glue holding it all together. The mansion that once echoed with shrieks and slammed doors now carried a different sound. Laughter, light footsteps, and the gentle hum of bedtime stories. Where chaos had once ruled, calm had taken root. Not silence, never silence, because the triplets were still as wild and energetic as ever, but a rhythm, a pulse of love and structure woven into daily life. Mornings became a ritual. Instead of the boys tearing through the halls in mismatched clothes, they now dressed themselves, sometimes a sock missing, sometimes a shirt buttoned crookedly, but always with pride. The maid didn't demand perfection. She praised their effort, correcting gently when needed, always with patience. Breakfast, once a battleground of spilled milk and flying toast, now unfolded like a small ceremony. Each boy had a role. One set the plates, another poured juice, the third carried napkins. They giggled, competed playfully, and every now and then looked to her for approval. She always gave it with a nod, and that faint, knowing smile. Afternoons, once dreaded by the staff, became adventures. The gardens that had been scenes of mud fights and chaos now became the setting for imaginative quests. Under her guidance, the boys were knights, explorers, even gardeners. They planted small flowers, learning how to tend to life, rather than destroy it. They splashed in puddles during the rain, but instead of screaming wars, they sang songs about pirates at sea. She never tried to erase their energy, she simply redirected it, helping them transform chaos into creativity. Evenings became the heart of the new rhythm. The triplets once fought tooth and nail against bedtime, turning the night into an exhausting war of wills. Now they climbed into bed, eager for her stories. Sometimes she read from a book, her voice steady and melodic. Other times she told them tales of her own childhood, of growing up with little, of making games out of nothing, of finding joy in the smallest places. The boys listened, eyes wide, imaginations painting worlds brighter than any video screen. By the end, they would curl against their pillows, heavy with sleep, their fists unclenched, their faces peaceful. The parents could hardly believe the transformation. The father, once distant and convinced that wildness was simply boyhood, now found himself drawn into their calmer games. He built Lego towers with them, let them climb onto his shoulders, even joined one of their pirate battles. The mother, often overwhelmed by her demanding schedule, discovered that when she came home, she wasn't met with chaos, but with order, her boys running to greet her with drawings and stories instead of tantrums. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. There were still arguments, still messes, still moments of frustration, but instead of spiraling into destruction, the boys recovered faster. They had learned, slowly and quietly, how to recognize their emotions and find calmer paths through them. And all of it stemmed from the maid's presence. The staff who once dreaded their jobs now found themselves smiling more, working in a home that felt lighter. Guests who visited noticed too. "Your boys are different," one remarked. "Happier, Sophie." "Tear, what changed?" The parents always gave the same answer, their eyes drifting toward the quiet figure in the background, the woman who had once entered their home invisible, broom in hand, and who now stood as the very foundation of their peace. The triplets adored her. She had become more than a caretaker. She was their safe place, their guide, their constant. One evening, as they clung to her arms, one of them whispered, "You're our family." And though she only smiled, blinking back tears, the truth was undeniable. She wasn't just the maid anymore, she was part of them. The mansion had been built with marble, gold, and crystal, but what truly made it a home wasn't its 50 million worth of beauty. It was love, patience, and the rhythm created by one woman who refused to give up on 3 wild boys. The revolving door of Nanny's had finally stopped. The curse of the triplets had been broken. And in its place stood something unshakable, a family bound together not by wealth but by understanding. A new family rhythm, stronger, softer, and more lasting than anything money could buy.